So anyway, thank you so much. I thought we should start with that. And I thank also the Latin American Social Forum for inviting me. Antonio has been in jail already for 13 years. He's got 21 years plus 5 years probation and parole as a re-sentence. And I think every single event that happens around the world where we remember them, such as this one, is important. And that was such an important thing. That was the first time that Antonio's voice was actually joining in a choir, saying, if I die, I will die for what I've done, for what I believe. Even though people might think that I'm silly. It's called El Necio, silly man. And that's what he's saying there. So I'm very grateful that we have a piece of historical evidence to share with you now. And I'd like to talk to you about human rights and the Cuban Five, specifically about human rights and how they have been systematically violated in the case of the Cuban Five. René, Antonio, Fernando, Gerardo, and Ramon. And as Freddie was saying, at the moment René is out of jail, but continues to be in prison effectively at home. Why do we say that it's a systematic violation of human rights? We say that because clearly the US is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but of course it uses all its power, money, contacts, etc., to violate them consistently. At the moment we have clear evidence that the US government took improper and illegal actions in prosecuting the Cuban Five and in securing their sentencing. They had a campaign that was controlled, paid for, and manipulated by the US government. It was a huge media campaign. We know that the US government has over $34 million a year to use in propaganda against the Cuban government. So they make use of these monies. And also they make use of these monies and power to protect the terrorist organizations that act in Miami against Cuba. Next on the left. Through a very lengthy process of defending the Cuban Five, they got a re-sentence, and these are the current sentences of the five comrades. So René was sentenced to 15 years, but plus 3 years probation and parole, and he started the probation and parole period in October just passed. Then Antonio managed to again lower his sentences to 21 years, which was more than what the prosecution had agreed to give him in any event, but that was the sentence given to him by the judge, plus 5 years of probation and parole. And if we based what will happen in the future on what has happened to René, it is likely that Antonio will have to remain in the US for the probation and parole period as well. Then Ramon, 30 years, Fernando, 17 years, and Gerardo, 2 life sentences, not concurrent, one after the other, plus 15 years. I apologize for my spelling mistakes there. Okay? Now, when we talk about human rights violations, we should note that any inmate in the US is allowed to have visits by the family monthly, regardless of their condition and the reasons for why they're imprisoned. In this case, we have both René Gonzalez's wife and family and Gerardo Hernandez's wife and family being prevented from visiting him ever, or visiting them ever, for the last 13 years, because the government has basically classified both Olga, the wife of René, and Adriana, the wife of Gerardo, as threats to the national security of the US. So they're not permitted to visit them at all. Amnesty International has said that this is beyond any penalty imposed, that it is unnecessarily punitive, and that it is contrary both to the standards of humane treatment of prisoners and to the state's obligation to protect family life. The other 3 comrades have had very few visits from sometimes relatives sometimes, people who are linked to their defense. Next one, Maria. Now, of course, we know that the declaration says that regardless of anyone's political opinion or country of birth, etc., you have the right to freedom. That, of course, is not the case for Cubans who support the Cuban government. Okay? So through this trial, the US has sought to neutralize the Cuban Five because they're hitting at the political beliefs that the Cuban Five have. If the Cuban Fives had been prepared to simply renege on their beliefs, they would be free by now. That is clear as well. So the aim is to punish Cuba and to all those who believe in a country like Cuba and a social system like Cuba, and to silencing people. And we see that used often by governments, that they are aiming to silence dissent. Okay. Now, perhaps one of the main issues through the trial is that we had a campaign, a strong campaign through public intimidation of the jury, public intimidation and threats of the jury as well. It was so clear that when it came to appeal in one of the many proceedings in this lengthy trial, that 3 judges defied the US government, and they found that the trial had not been fair at all in Miami. And they said, and this is, we should remember this, it's a court of appeal, and it said the pervasive community prejudice against Cuba and its government and the publicity before and during the trial combined to create a situation where the Cuban Five were unable to obtain a fair and impartial trial in Miami. So there is a precedent in law. We've got the 3 judges, but of course the US government moved very quickly to silence those judges, and through a decision of the full court, they resentenced, they confirmed the sentences. Article 5 of the declaration talks about torture, cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment from being, that no one should be subjected to that. We see through the treatment of the Cuban Five that they were put in solitary confinement at the beginning of their imprisonment, so they had no access to their defense teams and so forth, and from time to time they continued to be put in solitary confinement as a way of punishing them. Next one. There's been a lot of work done by organizations like this one in the US, trying to find evidence of the government, of the US government paying the journalists in Miami. And so we now have that evidence, and there's more proceedings going on at the moment because it is expected that more contracts will be established and more money will be shown to have been paid to journalists in Miami through the press, radio, TV. Okay. Many international organizations have condemned the trial of the Five and the sentences of the Five. Amnesty International, just a year ago, after a very lengthy review of all of the proceedings and the evidence, so-called evidence, said that they have serious concerns about the fairness and impartiality of the trial, and none of them have been resolved on appeal. So they called on the government to review and in fact to release the Cuban Five. Now, Gerardo is the comrade that faces an uphill battle, given that he has 2 life sentences plus 15 years. And the reason for that is that Gerardo's charges were basically one that he agreed to commit crimes, assassination, basically because of the downing of 2 planes of the Brothers to the Rescue by the Cuban government. Now, in fact, Gerardo did not participate in those acts, did not agree to participate, and had no knowledge that they were happening. But nonetheless, that is the criminal charge that was brought against him, and it's a charge that doesn't exist in the law as such. It is not a criminal act not to know about a government defending itself. Okay. So clearly there is no fairness, and this is a travesty of justice, what we've seen with the Cuban 5. So to bring you more up to date with what's happening in terms of Gerardo's Hernandez actions, on the 14th of June 2010, his defense team lodged a collateral appeal, which in the olden days it was called habeas corpus. But really it's an appeal, and it is the last possible appeal. He alleged that there's no basis for conspiracy. And on the 25th of April 2011, this year, the government replied to it, basically asking the district court not to hear any of the arguments. And on the 16th of August, Gerardo lodged the final reply to those arguments by the government. And they include evidence by his former lawyer. And I'd like to read a little bit to you from the lawyer. And also the evidence of Mara Verheiden-Ilya, who is the head of the team who has ascertained those payments to journalists and so forth. And she provided a list of the journalists, the articles written by them, and the money that was paid to them. We have not had any ruling on those motions as yet. Just basically read a little bit from the affidavit of Paul McKenna. And it says basically that he was appointed by the court as a kind of a legal aid lawyer that would be here to represent Hernandez in a criminal trial, and that was the most complicated trial that he had ever faced. It involved unusual facts, novel questions of law, and very high-profile proceedings. And this is a man who had a little office somewhere, and he was facing the entire U.S. government prosecution office. He said that he committed some errors through the proceedings. One of them was not to separate the trial of the other 4 comrades and the trial of Gerardo, so that the 4 comrades would not give evidence in support of Gerardo to say that he had not committed, he had not taken part in a conspiracy. That was one of the errors. And the other error is that he says that by trying to present evidence that Cuba was defending itself, it undermined the credibility of Gerardo, of course, in Miami. So instead of basically ascertaining that Gerardo did not participate, did not have intention to participate, did not know about any action by the Cuban government, he concentrated on saying the Cuban government has the right to defend itself. And that was a mistake at law, regrettably. So that's basically what Paul McKenna is saying. And of course we have also René, and in fact the 4 comrades have presented similar motions. But René's motion is quite important because he sought on the 16th of February to be taken out of the US and returned to Cuba. Now in Australia, and the majority of countries that I know, if you are given a period of good behavior, probation and parole, you can be released and deported, in fact. And there's a lot of perhaps people who come from our countries who have been imprisoned in this country and then released back to their countries. That is a normal thing to do. But in the case of René, of course, he's one of the Cuban 5s. The US government fought against that sort of motion. And on the 16th of September, Judge Leonard, who is the judge presiding on all of these motions in the Southern District Court of Florida, rejected it. And you might remember also when we had the period of control orders here in Australia, and a couple of prominent cases of Australians who were in the Arabic world and came back accused of terrorist acts. They were put on control orders. And one of the control orders was not to mix with terrorists. In this case, one of the conditions imposed on René is quite similar. It says he's in Miami, and it says he's prevented from being nearby or visiting specific places where terrorist groups or individuals meet. I don't know how you can avoid that in Miami. 600 Cubans, 600,000 Cubans, all against Cuba, all part of, well, not everyone, but a large part of them, of course, members of anti-Castro, anti-Cuban organizations. So what we see, of course, is that there's a a lot of concern for his life. And when we go back to the other comrade, Fernando, we will have the same concern. So how do you protect the comrades once they are still in the US? How do you keep them supported enough? Rene is still not allowed to see his wife, even though he's on probation. So the wife is not allowed to go to the US. So clearly there's no independence of the judiciary from the government. There's no impartiality. The government has used illegal acts to prosecute and secure the sentences of these people. And it's such an outcry internationally that they call it, arrogant, they call it shameful, etc. But that's a situation. Noam Chomsky, who was recently here, said, "It's shameful but regrettably not surprising that at the time the Supreme Court has refused to review the sentencing of the 5 Cubans. And the crime that they committed," he says, "was for uncovering plans for terrorist acts against Cuba and to report it to the US authorities." That is really the crime committed. The lawyer Osamu Yatabe, he's the coordinator of all of the amicus brief that were filed in the states in support of the Cuban 5. He said, "The decision of the court is truly arrogant. The US has no entitlement to speak about human rights, and we must continue to work, putting more effort into securing the release of the Cuban 5. And Bishop Thomas Campbelltown of Detroit, "I am very disillusioned with the court's decision. I hope that they will review the case and that they will free the Cuban 5. I realize now that they will not be given a genuine opportunity for justice." And perhaps just to conclude and say that the defense team for the 5 comrades continue to work extremely hard in difficult circumstances, often having to appeal to individuals like us for support, not only monetary support, but also support in denouncing the situation. They will continue to lodge motions and pursue that. But however, the feeling is that clearly the avenue is not the legal system. The avenue for any release of the Cuban 5 is solidarity and international pressure. Recently in Cuba, there was a colloquium, an international colloquium, a gathering, and 45 countries were represented, and that was basically in support of the Cuban 5. And they issued a number of guidelines for work to continue internationally, and they say that what we need to do is to have a broad campaign of permanent denunciation of what's happening with the Cuban 5. We need to work with lawyers, universities, students. It doesn't matter what language it is that you do it, but we just have to do it. So your community groups, any organization that you belong to, take a video of the Cuban 5, discuss it, pass a motion, and send it to the US, which is where the international organizations in support of the 5 are centered. Don't just keep it amongst us. This is a gathering for human rights. We're talking about the Cuban 5s. We should also let them know we have done so. We keep them in our minds, and we will continue to work towards their freedom. So I encourage you not to just stop here, but to take the information you've got and contact those organizations in whatever language you can. On the 5th of every month, there's a campaign for the Cuban 5 where you're asked to send letters to Barack Obama. So please don't forget that. Again, you can do that in Spanish, Arabic, whatever language it is, and with a copy to the international campaign for the Cuban 5. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for that important update on a very important campaign, one that the Latin America Social Forum, together with many other Cuba Solidarity groups here in Sydney, the Free the Five Committee, the Australian-Cuba Friendship Society, and others have been campaigning around for a number of years. And of course we know that when it comes to Cuba, it's not just the issue of the Cuban Five, but also perhaps the biggest violation of human rights against the Cuban people, which is the economic blockade that the United States has had on Cuba for basically for 5 decades now. And I think it was very interesting and important to note that at the recent conference of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations or Caribbean States held in Caracas on the 2nd and 3rd of December, an organisation that involves all of the countries of the region, including Cuba, but not the United States and Canada. A very strong resolution was put there denouncing once again the criminal blockade against the people of Cuba. And we should remember that Cuba was expelled from the Organisation of American States, which does include the US and Canada, simply for its right to stand up and say that it wanted to live in its country, run its country under a different system to that imposed by US for so many decades. So I think there's been some important advances in that regard. But I think if we're talking about international human rights day, it's certainly not a case that there are only human rights questions occurring in Latin America, but there are also ones that are occurring both in other areas of the world, and I refer specifically to another campaign that's been a long-running campaign for many activists here in Australia, which is in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but also very much the struggle here at home, and that is a struggle in solidarity with the Aboriginal people as well. And I think there are many parallels that could be drawn between the situation of the Palestinian people and the Aboriginal people here in Australia.